of all, Jazakumullah khairan for having me here today. I know this is a new masjid, and I feel honored to be here. Today, Brother Dan had asked me to give a khateeb today, and I was reading a book entitled Dawaa. It's a very famous book in the Islamic spirituality genre. And it's by a very famous scholar by the name of al-Qayyim. I think you guys are covering one of his other books with Sheikh Muhammad Sadi going over Bachelor. And if you've attended that class or you've come across any of Ibn Qayyim's books, you will know that he is a spiritual cardiologist. Someone who knows the depths of the heart, the inner workings of the heart, the spirituality of the heart. And so he wrote this book called Dawaa, translated in English, which means the disease and the cure. And basically, why he wrote the book was someone had asked him a question. Someone had asked him, what do the scholars say about a person who's basically addicted to a sin? The sin has become an addiction for him. It's a strong temptation within his heart. He cannot remove the sin from his heart. He finds himself constantly going back. And so he wrote this book called al-Qayyim. Even sat down in Dawaa, the sufficing, the sufficient, the satisfying answer to the one who asked about the cure. So in the entire book, he's speaking about sin, the disease of sin, the effects of sin, the harms of sin, the punishments of sin. The entire book is about sin. And then he comes towards the end of the book, he starts speaking about the cure for temptation, the cure for a sin being rooted in the heart. Because when a sin becomes an addiction, when it becomes something that's rooted in the heart, it's a sickness that slowly starts to wither away the iman. It starts to take a person farther away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so he starts to address how to cure this sin. But before he goes into curing, or how to cure yourself from temptation or infatuation with the sin, he basically breaks up the treatment into two treatments: preventive medicine and curative medicine. And in your physical body, when it comes to preventing disease, what are some of the things you do? You diet, you eat a healthy diet, you exercise, you make sure you're eating the right foods. So these are preventative measures you take. And so he goes into the preventative medicines. Inshallah, we'll cover the two things that he mentions for prevention when it comes to letting sin take your heart, or letting the shahwa, a desire, take your heart. And the first thing he mentions is ghadul basar, which is to lower your gaze. And we hear this so often, lowering the gaze. It's like, it's become something that's it's said often, but how much do we actually apply lowering the gaze in our lives? And how dangerous is not lowering the gaze? Just to understand how important the gaze is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about zina, he said, إِنَّهُ كَانَ فَاحِشَةً وَسَاءَ سَبِيلًا, that it's a illicit, a lewd deed, and something that leads to an evil path. This is zina, right? How harmful, how big zina is. And then in Surah An-Nur, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us how to avoid zina, he says, كُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنِينَ يَغُضُّوا مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِمْ وَيَحْفَظُوا فُرُوجَهُم كُلِّ الْمُؤْمِنَاتِ يَغُضُّضْنَ مِنْ أَبْصَارِهِنَّ وَيَحْفَظْنَ فُرُوجَهُم. That tell the believing men and women to lower their gaze and to guard their private parts. So when we compare the sin is zina, and then Allah is telling us how to prevent it, we realize the importance of this action of lowering the gaze. Ibn al-Qayyim, he says that the gaze is manfadun ila al-qalb. It's a pathway, it's a gateway, it's an opening to the heart. It's something that leads to the heart. Everything that enters into the eyes, it goes into the heart. It's not like we can put a filter in front of our eyes and not allow, we can throw away whatever we want. And this is something that we've all experienced. How often have we seen something that was disturbing and then we cannot take the image out of our minds? We see something that disturbs our heart or our mind, and then we're praying and the image comes to our mind, or we're doing something and the image comes to our mind. Because once something enters into the eyes, there's no way to take it out. And so he starts off by saying, watch what goes into your eyes. And to let you understand this with an example, if someone lived by, let's say, garbage dump, or even a chemical warehouse where chemicals were in the air, or the smell of the garbage was in the air. And they opened up their windows, and they wanted the smell not to come into their house. Would they be able to stop the smell from coming? Would they be able to stop those chemicals from coming? It's very unlikely. So if the smell came into their homes, they would not be able to blame anyone except for themselves. Similarly, your eyes, because they're a gateway to your heart, to be mindful of the things that enter. And this is him saying this 600, 700 years ago. What could have been the fitna that they were looking at? You know, if you look at these books of tazkiyah, you see the scholars, they mention like not looking at surah, looking at certain pictures that bring lust. This is them speaking 600, 700 years ago about pictures. What kind of pictures could they have been looking at compared to the things that we have today? Compared to the fitna that we have today. So, guarding the eyes. And he mentions some of the benefits of guarding the eyes. One of the first things he mentions is that you're fulfilling the commandment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah commanded you to lower your gaze. And the second thing he mentions is that you prevent as-sahm al-masmoom, the poisoned arrow of shaitan, because the nava is a poisoned arrow that shaitan strikes into your heart, and it's difficult to take care of. The third thing he mentions is that when you lower your gaze, it increases your uns billah, your togetherness with Allah, feeling that closeness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that we can appreciate, because how often do we, let's say for example, go on social media, or social media is probably the best example, because when you go on social media, you see a bombardment of information. It's just picture, video, post, news, and then your mind is all over the place. Your mind is everywhere. Your heart is kind of scattered. Your mind is scattered. You feel like you can't focus. SubhanAllah, al-Qayyim mentions this. He mentions that when you allow your gaze to go everywhere, it creates this disunity in your heart. Whereas when you lower your gaze, it creates that spiritual togetherness with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the last thing he mentions is that when you give up looking at that which is haram, Allah replaces your physical sight, He basically compensates that sacrifice with spiritual nur, with light that allows you to have spiritual insight. And with that spiritual insight, you're able to distinguish right from wrong. You're able to see things for what they are. When everyone else is misguided, everyone else is letting their biases take them around in their life, you're able to look at things and distinguish them, see them for what they are. In the Sharia, there's something called al-jazaa min jins al-amal, that the compensation for something, Allah compensates you according to the action. So if the action is very big, the punishment is very big. And if the action is very good, then the reward is also very good. And he uses this to say that just as you've given up your sight, your physical sight of haram, Allah, when you leave something for Allah, Allah replaces it with something better. And so when you leave looking at the haram, Allah replaces it with that spiritual basira, with that spiritual insight that allows you to navigate life. And one of the beautiful things he mentions is that when you look at in Surah An-Nur, the verses of lowering the gaze, when Allah commands the believing man and women to lower their gaze, it's on the right side of the page on most mushaf. If you open that verse, it will be on the right side. And if you read it, you continue to read, that's a commandment, right? To lower your gaze, guard your private parts. And you come to the next page. At the bottom of the next page is the famous ayah, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the source of light of the heavens and the earth. مَثَلُ نُورِهِ كَمِشْكَاةٍ فِيهَا مِصْبَاحٌ. That the similitude of his light is like a lantern that's within a niche. It's basically the heart of the believer that's filled with iman. Allah fills it with light. And it's as if Allah is saying that if you follow this commandment of lowering your gaze, I will fill your heart and your sight with light that will guide you. And so, when it comes to lowering the gaze, it's not just about lowering the gaze in the masjid, because it's very easy to lower the gaze in the masjid. A lot of times you see, when it comes to interactions in the masjid between brothers and sisters, we become so conservative. But then, the same brother or the same sister, when we walk outside the masjid, in our workplace or in other places, we're much more free, much more open. It's not that we should be extreme in either sides, but that we should find a moderate path that we follow inside the masjid and outside the masjid. And even more important is not that we lower our gaze only in the masjid or outside the masjid, but into our own homes. In our own homes, because now all these things are available in the house. So when we're by ourselves, that's the true test of our lowering our gaze. Are we lowering our gaze? Are we allowing things to enter our hearts in our homes? Just as you would not, if you have diabetes, you would not eat a lot of sugar. Or if you have cholesterol, you would not eat a lot of fatty foods. Similarly, because it's poison to your body. What's more important than your physical body is your spiritual heart. And so just as you watch what you consume for your physical body, you should also watch what you consume for your spiritual heart. What do you allow into those things? And the second thing he mentions, and we'll do this one quickly, so I know the time is short, is, so the first thing he mentions is lowering the gaze. The second thing he mentions is your heart. He says that you have to lower your gaze and then you have to watch your heart. And he says that the heart, if it is empty, if the heart is empty, doesn't have anything within it, then when the temptation comes, it will enter and find a place to stay. Whereas if the heart is protected, the heart is populated, it has something within it, it will keep things out. It will not allow something to come. Just like an empty house. If you have an empty house and the robber comes or someone comes to break in, there's no resistance, nothing inside. Whereas if there's something with someone in that house, that robber will think twice. Similarly with your heart, he says that there should be two emotions. One, you should at least have one of them. And he says one of them is al-khawf al-muqlaq, and the other one is al-hub al-muz'ij. And al-khawf al-muqlaq is the worrisome fear, the worrying fear, the fear that worries you. And that fear is of course the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But on top of that, it's the fear to lose out on a relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fear that if I do this sin, what will I miss out on? I will miss out on being with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I will miss out on feeling close to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I will miss out on the reward that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has for me. And not only that, but if I allow the sin to enter my heart, what are the harms that will come to me from this sin? So the fear of the harms that will come from that sin. Because a lot of the times we have a misconception, al-Qayyim, he mentions this in the book, we have the misconception that we do a sin, and then tomorrow, alhamdulillah, we still have our car, we still have our house, we still have our nice bank account, we still have our job, we still have so much good in our life. So we think that, you know what, Allah just forgave this sin, but this sin is not going to affect me. Because tomorrow is okay, or next week is okay, or next month is okay. It must mean that Allah is still happy with me. And in al-Qayyim, he says that no, it may be that you do a sin today, and Allah catches you for that sin 1 year later. A musibah comes to you, and it was because of that sin you committed 1 year. Or 10 years later you get a sickness, and it is from that sin that you committed 10 years ago, and that you thought that Allah forgot about, or Allah left. And so that fear, or the effects of that sin coming back, the fear of losing out with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the fear of missing out in that relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, should be a fear that when the temptation comes, it drives that temptation away. So these are the two things, making sure that your heart is filled with these emotions that bring you closer with Allah. And I think Shaykh Muhammad Sadi is going to continue, right? So some of the things he'll be mentioning are the emotions that you want within your heart. The emotions of wakefulness, the emotion of tawakkul, of azima, of having strong resolve. These are things you want to have in your heart. And there's so much more that can be said. Inshallah, the book is The Disease and the Cure by al-Qayyim. I recommend everyone to get it, to read it. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to fill our hearts with the fear that worries us and with the love that keeps us from sin and allows us to be people who guard their eyesight. Subhanallah wa bihamdihi, ashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk.